You know, when you really stop and think about it, stones and crystals have this kind of quiet but persistent presence all through Christianity.
Hmm.
From like the very start of the biblical stories to traditions that grew up later, they're definitely there.
It's really interesting just how deeply interwoven this all is. We're not just talking
Yeah.
about, a few random mentions.
Right.
These things pop up right from Genesis all the way through to the visions and Revelation.
Exactly. And that's just what we're digging into in this deep dive. We got this great collection of sources from a listener, articles, history, theology, all looking at Jesus, Christianity, and, well, rocks and gems.
Mm.
So our mission today is to unpack all that, really try to get a handle on this connection, the symbols, the history, how they've been seen in Christian contexts.
And think about how they show up. I mean, in creation itself, right?
Mm.
As basic materials,
Yeah.
then as symbols, carrying a lot of weight. And finally, you get that incredible picture of the New Jerusalem. It sets up this interesting tension, doesn't it? Stones as these like unchanging solid things,
Mm.
but also as tools, you could say, for showing big changes and transformation in Christian thinking.
Okay, yeah, let's dive into that transformation idea a bit more because it feels like we start with literal stones,
Mm-hmm.
just rocks, actual gems,
Mm-hmm.
and then they sort of grow into these powerful metaphors, and then sometimes people even see them as having some kind of mystical side. We need to carefully look at those different layers.
That's crucial. Teasing apart those different views.
Right.
What's clear biblical symbolism? What's, folk tradition that built up around them?
Right.
And where do we see maybe more modern spiritual ideas coming in? Keeping those distinctions clear is going to be really important here.
Absolutely. And we've got some specifics lined up for today. We're definitely going to look at Bloodstone. That's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
And dig into biblical stone symbolism like the high priest's breastplate, the New Jerusalem descriptions, and we'll even touch on how Christians view this idea of crystal power. And like always, we're aiming for an unbiased look, just understanding what the sources tell us. So where do we kick off this stony exploration?
Well, let's start with Bloodstone. It's a really great example of how a stone's look, its appearance, and the stories around it get tangled up with religious ideas.
Bloodstone, right, also called heliotrope. That's in the quartz family, isn't it?
Mm.
Dark green with those red spots that look like blood. Makes sense, the name.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that long before Christianity picked it up, bloodstone meant a lot in other cultures.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like in Mesopotamia, they used it for divination. Ancient Greece and Rome athletes thought it gave them stamina. Warriors carried it for protection, maybe even to stop bleeding.
Wow.
It was the birthstone for March, linked to Mars, god of war. And in India, they apparently ground it up as an aphrodisiac.
Serious? Okay, so it had this reputation already.
Right.
Powerful, mystical, even.
Right, exactly. It was seen that way well before the Christian connection started.
So how did that Christian connection happen? I heard it was tied to the crucifixion legend, maybe in the Middle Ages.
That's the one. The story goes that when Christ's blood dripped down at the cross onto green earth, some say, or maybe onto jasper, it miraculously turned into bloodstone. Those red flecks became symbols of his blood.
Ah, I see. That's potent imagery.
Very potent. And because of that, Christians started wearing it, like a tribute to his sacrifice. It got nicknamed the Martyr's Stone. You even find old carvings of the crucifixion right on bloodstone itself.
You can really see that visual link being so important. And it sounds like the stone's power, or what people thought it could do, changed over time, too.
Precisely. Early on, the powers were more, let's say, practical, folkloric, stopping bleeding, warding off evil, kind of directly linked to how it looked. Then, with the Christian legend, the power shifted to being symbolic, representing martyrdom, inspiring courage, piety. And now, you fast forward to like the modern New Age movement, and the powers attributed are different again. More functional, energetic things like healing, purification, vibrating healing energies, even connecting to chakras.
It's almost like a three-stage thing. Practical uses, then symbolic meaning, now this idea of inherent energy.
Yeah, its journey really shows how an object can pick up layers of meaning, from practical stuff based on looks to religious meaning tied to a huge event, and then finally these more personal, energetic ideas in modern spirituality. It kind of reflects how we always try to find meaning and power in the world around us.
So what were some of those specific powers people attributed to it across the different times?
Well, historically, you see courage, justice, protection. And like we said, a purification stone.
Right.
Now, in contemporary New Age circles, you hear claims about healing blood issues, detoxification, better circulation, supporting organs, even helping with PMS or menopause.
Quite a range.
Yeah, and spiritually, it's seen as this energetic amulet, right? Promoting healing, mental clarity, self-esteem, creativity, easing anxiety, and balancing the root chakra, which is about grounding, vitality, that sort of thing.
It's amazing how diverse that list is. But what really strikes me is how that look, the dark green with red spots, seems to be the thread running through it all.
Absolutely. That visual is key. The name itself comes right from it.
Yeah.
The early uses, like stopping bleeding,
Yeah.
probably inspired by the look. And crucially, that central Christian legend, Christ's blood, creating the stone that depends entirely on the visual. It just shows how what we see can really shape our stories and beliefs.
Okay, so Bloodstone is a great case study for how stones and Christian stories mix. But the Bible itself, I mean, it's just full of stones. Let's pivot to that now, maybe starting with the Old Testament.
Good idea. Because stones are, foundational in the Old Testament narrative. You find them right at the start. Genesis,
Yeah.
part of God's creation in Eden. And then you have these really profound moments, like Moses and the elders seeing God's presence on what's described as a sapphire stone, linking stones directly to God's majesty.
And the Ten Commandments, obviously.
The Ten Commandments, yeah, etched onto stone tablets, the absolute bedrock of the law.
But it wasn't just about God's presence or law, was it? Stones were also used as, markers, witnesses.
Exactly right. Think about Jacob. He anoints the stone he slept on after his dream. It becomes a marker of his covenant. Or Jacob and Laban piling up stones to seal their agreement. These weren't just rocks. They stood for lasting truth, remembering promises, that permanence and faithfulness.
And then there's the high priest's breastplate. That's just incredible, using precious stones right at the heart of worship and identity.
Oh, absolutely. That breastplate had 12 specific precious stones, each one carved with the name of an Israelite tribe.
Wow.
And the high priest wore it right over his heart. It was a constant memorial before God, showing his role and praying for the whole community.
So like a representation.
Exactly. And you mentioned Josephus. Yeah, there were interpretations, even back then, suggesting maybe the stones matched the months or the signs of the zodiac.
Interesting.
These parallel uses of precious stones really point to a core theme, actually. In the Old Testament, they represent the earthly community linked to God. Then in the New, they symbolize the perfected heavenly community. They're like these tangible bridges between the divine and us.
It's like they weren't just pretty decorations, they were actively doing something, representing the people to God. Okay, so that sets the scene in the Old Testament. How does this stone imagery carry over into the New Testament, especially with Jesus?
Well, building on that Old Testament foundation, it's fascinating how the symbolism continues and even gets amplified in the New Testament, focused on Jesus.
Oh, so?
Think about how often God is called a rock in the Old Testament, symbolizing like he's unshakable.
Right, a fortress.
Exactly. And that same imagery gets applied directly to Jesus. Even back in Genesis, Jacob blesses Joseph and calls God the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Many see that as pointing forward to Christ.
And Peter really runs with that, doesn't he? Calling Jesus the living stone. That's such a vivid image, not just a dead foundation, but something alive.
Precisely. Living stone, rejected by men, but choice and precious. And then he says, believers are living stones being built into a spiritual house. It's this powerful picture of the church built on Christ.
Cornerstone, yeah. The absolutely vital piece holding it all together.
Exactly. Ephesians calls Jesus the chief cornerstone, the essential piece. And the whole structure rests on the apostles and prophets. Think about that prophecy. The stone the builders rejected becomes the cornerstone.
That's central.
It's about Christ's rejection, but then his ultimate divine place. But it has two sides, because for those who don't believe, he becomes a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense.
And we shouldn't forget Daniel's vision, right? The stone smashing the kingdoms.
Oh, absolutely. That vision of a stone cut out without hands that crushes earthly powers and then grows into this huge mountain. It's a powerful prophecy of Christ coming back as king, establishing his eternal kingdom.
So the metaphors around Jesus and stones are incredibly rich. But there were actual literal stones in his life story too, weren't there?
Yes, definitely. You have the Pilate stone archaeology backing up Pilate's existence.
Right.
There's the Gabbatha or Lithostrutos, the stone pavement, where Jesus stood trial before Pilate.
Okay.
And then, hugely significant, that very great stone rolled away from the tomb a massive symbol of resurrection, victory over death.
You forget that one.
Even in his teaching, like the parable of the sower seeds falling on rocky ground, meaning shallow faith. And when he said if his followers were silent, the stones would immediately cry out. That speaks to all creation testifying to truth.
It really shows this amazing continuity, doesn't it? From the Old Testament laying the groundwork with stones to the New Testament where it all culminates in Christ. You mentioned the 12 stones on the breastplate and the 12 foundation stones of the New Jerusalem. There seems to be a deliberate echo there.
Absolutely. There's this beautiful theological thread running through. The Old Testament uses marking covenants, representing tribes. They all seem to point forward. They find their ultimate fulfillment in the New Testament, in Jesus and the church. The stone of Israel, hinting at the living stone, the chief cornerstone. It really shows God's consistent plan unfolding.
And speaking of that ultimate fulfillment, let's talk about that vision of the New Jerusalem in Revelation, just covered in precious stones.
It's breathtaking, isn't it? The level of detail is amazing. The city wall itself is made of jasper, and the 12 foundations, they're adorned with this incredible list. Jasper, sapphire, chalcedony, emerald, onyx, sardius, that's ruby, chrysolite, beryl, topaz, chrysoprase, jacinth, and amethyst.
Wow.
It's just this overwhelming picture of eternal glory, God's perfect purity, his lasting presence that really connects earth and heaven, and the gates, 12 gates, each one a single giant pearl.
A single pearl.
Yeah, emphasizing that ultimate perfection.
It feels like this symbolic journey upwards, from the earthly uses in the Old Testament, Jacob's rock pillow, the law tablets, the breastplate for earthly tribes, to this totally heavenly scene in Revelation. Crystal, precious foundations, pearl gates.
Exactly. It's a move from the temporary to the eternal, from the imperfections of life here to the absolute glory and purity of God's kingdom. It really highlights the end time significance, the eschatological meaning of stones in Christian thought. They aren't just worldly objects. They become part of the very fabric of heaven.
Okay, so we've looked at the big picture of stones, literal and metaphorical, through the Bible. Let's zoom in now on some of those specific gemstones and what they symbolize in Christianity. And we should probably stress again, the power here is symbolic meaning, right? Not magic.
Precisely. Their meaning comes from how they're used in the Bible and in theology. Take amethyst, that lovely purple stone. It's in the breastplate and the New Jerusalem foundations. It often stands for piety, humility, spiritual wisdom. It's seen as calming, which is maybe why you see it in religious jewelry, symbolizing faith, a sacred calling. So if you've seen amethyst used that way, that's the thinking behind it.
Okay. And sapphire, that deep blue, like the sky.
Exactly. That points to divine favor, wisdom, purity. Being in the breastplate, a foundation stone, and linked to the vision of God's throne, it really gives it this sense of being chosen and seen by God. It represents protection, spiritual insight.
What about ruby or sardius? You said it's sometimes called that fiery red.
That one's linked to wisdom and beauty, yeah.
Yeah.
But its big Christian symbols are love, passion, vitality, and crucially, Christ's blood and also God's cleansing fire. It's even seen as offering protection from negative energy.
And emerald, the green one.
That's all about rebirth, renewal, spiritual growth, faith and hope. It's linked to the tribe of Levi, associated with healing, representing God's promise to restore us, open our understanding.
Pearls are interesting, not technically stones, but so important, especially in Jesus' parable in Revelation.
Oh, absolutely. The parable of the pearl of great price. That says it all about the supreme value of the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
And by the gates of the New Jerusalem, symbolizing purity, wisdom, the perfection of Christ, they bring a sense of calm, integrity.
Then there's topaz, with those yellow golden colors.
Topaz stands for truth and forgiveness. It's thought to bring joy, abundance, good health. It suggests God loves clarity and also how we get refined through trials.
And jasper. You said that comes in lots of colors.
Yeah, it's described as clear reflecting light, and it makes up the wall of the New Jerusalem. So it represents strength, courage, determination, protection, especially when things are stressful. Really shows God's glory and majesty.
What about onyx, the black and white banded one?
Onyx symbolizes protection, strength, being grounded. It's about self-control, inner strength, having a kind of authority, leading with integrity.
And carnelian, that warm orangey red.
That one's associated with courage, motivation, endurance, confidence, and passion.
And lastly, turquoise. Not explicitly in the Bible, but you said it shows up in Christian art.
Exactly. Not a direct biblical mention, but historically, yeah, it's used in Christian art and artifacts, often linked to healing, protection, spiritual attunement, representing heaven, spiritual grounding.
It's amazing how these specific stones, just through context and tradition, become these little packets of symbolic meaning.
It is, and it helps to see them listed out: color, reference, meaning. You notice the overlap, like you said, between the breastplate and New Jerusalem,
Mm-hmm.
but also these subtle shifts added layers of meaning over time.
Mm-hmm.
And then stones like turquoise that find their place through tradition. It shows that dynamic continuity again, meanings evolving through theology and folklore, just like Bloodstone.
And thinking back to that breastplate again, it wasn't just symbolic, was it? It had a practical function in worship back then.
Oh, absolutely practical. Having those 12 stones for the 12 tribes right over the high priest's heart, it was a constant, visible reminder of his job praying for everyone. And the idea that maybe the gems carried prayers to heaven. That suggests a kind of conduit function. It was a compact, portable, very visual way to represent the whole community before God. A constant reminder of the covenant.
Okay, so we've traced these really deep historical and symbolic roots connecting stones, crystals, and Christianity. But what about now? These more modern ideas about crystals having inherent properties, maybe heavenly energy? How do Christians tend to see that?
Yeah, this is where things get really diverse. You've got a whole spectrum.
Okay.
On one side, many Christians will say, yes, crystals are beautiful parts of God's creation. They show his glory. Some are okay appreciating them as objects, maybe even tools, as long as the belief remains firm that God alone is the source of healing and power.
So any energy comes from God.
Exactly. Attributed to God, not inherent in the stone. You even have traditions, like in Orthodox Christianity, talking about an unspotted stone holding Christ's image.
But there's a much stronger warning from other perspectives, right?
Oh, definitely. Many Christians warn very strongly against giving stones special powers, healing, magic, spiritual stuff. They often see that as slipping into occultism.
Occultism, how so?
Well, the concern is it violates the first commandment, seeking power from something other than God.
Yeah.
They might point to Bible passages condemning witchcraft, sorcery, divination, like in Deuteronomy 18.
Ah, okay.
The theological argument is God is the only true source of healing, guidance.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible talks about the beauty and value of stones, yes, but never gives them mystical powers. Using them for healing, some would say, is manipulation, maybe even touching the occult. There are warnings against amulets, too, in Ezekiel.
So believing the crystal itself has power is seen as what? A lack of faith.
Pretty much, yeah. A lack of faith in God's power, as mentioned in Psalms, for example. The Catholic Church is quite clear it rejects crystal energy as deceptive, putting it in the same category as divination and magic, according to the Catechism. That whole context in Deuteronomy 18 was God telling the Israelites not to copy the pagan practices around them, practices trying to get power or knowledge outside of him. So believing crystals have independent power could look like that to some Christians.
So the really crucial difference seems to be appreciate them as creation or symbols, okay, but believe they have their own power. That's where the problem comes in for many.
That's the core distinction. The Bible emphasizes symbolic beauty, value, no inherent power. Modern healing crystal ideas, often from New Age beliefs, see crystals having intrinsic energy from the earth, sometimes viewing nature itself as sacred.
Right, which is different from a transcendent creator God.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of scientific evidence, or lack thereof, for healing or magical claims. It also comes down to epistemology, how we know things. New Age ideas might rely more on personal experience or anecdotes, which isn't the same as a framework based on divine revelation.
And the biggest theological worry for many Christians comes down to idolatry, doesn't it? Worshipping creation instead of the creator.
Precisely that. God is seen as the exclusive source of protection, healing. Giving those roles to a stone, without recognizing God's role, is seen as superstition, moving away from monotheism.
But you mentioned a bit of nuance, especially in Catholicism, about blessed objects. How does that work?
Yeah, that's where intent and the source of power become really key. Things like holy water, relics, blessed metals, they're seen as channels for God's grace through faith. The object itself doesn't have power.
Okay, I see the difference.
So while crystal energy is rejected as a cult, using, say, a rosary made with gemstones or wearing a blessed metal is fine because the power is understood to come from God through prayer and faith, not the object. It's about symbolic aids, blessed channels, versus claiming inherent, maybe manipulative power in the object.
So it really highlights this fundamental tension, doesn't it, between the biblical way of seeing things and these other maybe folkloric or New Age ways of understanding the world and where power comes from.
It really does. It's fascinating to see that difference in epistemology the theory of knowledge, how do we know what's true? The Bible presents a worldview rooted in God's revelation. Stones are created, symbolic, but not powerful in themselves. Folkloric and New Age views often draw on different sources, anecdotes, energy fields, mixing traditions, attributing inherent power to nature. It really boils down to different views of reality and the ultimate source of power. A transcending God versus perhaps forces within the universe itself.
Wow. This has been a really illuminating deep dive, looking at stones and crystals through this Christian perspective. We've covered so much ground, from Bloodstone folklore to deep biblical symbolism and these varied modern views.
Yeah, and if you try to boil it down, I think the key takeaway is that central difference, isn't it? Appreciating stones as God's creation, as powerful symbols in the Bible, that's one thing.
Right.
But attributing inherent power to them, that's a whole different viewpoint, and one that often bumps up against core Christian beliefs.
It really drives home that idea that the real power of these stones in a Christian framework is metaphorical. It's symbolic. It points us back towards God and his bigger purposes.
Absolutely. And maybe that leaves you, the listener, with something to think about. Now that we've explored all this rich symbolism and history, how might understanding the biblical and historical side of stones and crystals maybe reshape how you see the natural world, or even your own faith?
That's a great question.
And beyond that, what other ordinary things around us might hold unexpected layers of meaning within a spiritual context, just waiting to be uncovered?